Okay, so step one is to secure your printed circuit board. Here I've got it in a small vise, and once it's secure, and it should be clean as well, we can start heating up parts. And I'm starting with the switch. It's a good place to start. It's a larger part and it's simpler to solder, so that's a good place for you to start as well. So notice how I'm doing this. I'm heating up the wire that comes out of the switch with the soldering iron. And then I'm adding the solder and melting it after the part becomes hot, the wire on the actual switch. So heat up the part and then add the solder. If the solder doesn't melt right away, your part is not hot enough. So again, heat up the part and then add the solder. If it's not quite right, heat it up and remelt it again. Next we're going to go up above on the USB port, and there's the two large tabs that hold the USB port in place. Now those are going to take a lot of heat. In other words, we're going to have to heat that up for a long period of time with our soldering iron and then add the solder. If the solder doesn't melt, it's not hot enough. So first one done. Let's go ahead and do the same with the second one. Lots of heat, so again, lots of time there on that big solder tab. And if the solder melts, you know you're good to go. Now that'll hold our USB port in place real securely. All right, next let's work on some of the header connectors. These won't take quite so much heat to accomplish, so not quite as much time is needed on each joint. So heat up the joint and then add the solder. And work methodically through all your header pins. Get them all soldered. I'm just going to do a few here for this video. Take your time. It will wind up taking less time in the end if you work slowly. You can see the little spatter every so often. There is something in the core of this solder called rosin that helps the solder flow a little better, and sometimes that spurts out a little bit when you're heating it up. I'm going to go ahead and do these LED wires. They're kind of hanging there and they're in the way. So let's go ahead and heat those up same way we would do the header pins. Only it's just a little harder to get at because the big wires are hanging there. So go ahead and all three LED wires, well actually there's 6 there, so all 3 LEDs, let's get them soldered into place. And once they're in place, let's cut those wires away and get them out of the way. So I've got my wire snippers here, and we'll snip those out of the way. Make everything a little easier to work on. And we don't want any wires hanging up that might bend over and short out into the next connection point, so make sure they're real nice and short and they won't bend over. Now we'll go ahead and solder our IC socket in place. Once again, we're going to want to do every connection there. Watch closely here and see what happened. Look, we've got 2 of the IC sockets connections are now shorted out. They've got what's called a solder bridge. So I'm going to bring in something called solder wick. This will suck up the solder. I'll heat up the solder wick and it will suck the solder away from between the 2 connections. So that's a good way to clean it up. So if you have solder bridges, go ahead and clean that up. Also, another good tip is to make sure that your soldering iron tip stays nice and clean. You can see mine at the moment isn't real clean. I'll be cleaning it in just a minute here. But here's our 4 USB connections. They're the smallest connections that we're going to have to deal with. Really take it easy on the solder on these. So heat up your part nice and hot, and then just a little bit of solder on those USB connections. If you get too much on, grab your solder wick and clean it up so there's not too much there. So one of the most important steps that you'll be taking here is the final inspection. You can see I've got my printed circuit board all soldered now, but we're going to want to take a real good close look at the printed circuit board and look for mistakes. And you'll see in this case I've got a solder bridge on one of my connections. So I want to go in there and I want to take that solder wick and remove that solder bridge and make sure that there's no bridge there. But otherwise, look at all your connections, make sure they're all kind of shiny, and make sure that there's enough solder filling the hole and so forth. Make sure everything looks like it makes a really, really good connection. You'll have a much more reliable printed circuit board in the end. So that's it. Patience and practice make for good soldering in the end. Have fun soldering, and hopefully you've got a completed printed circuit board, mostly completed printed circuit board, by next week. And next week we're going to add a couple of jumper wires and our battery pack, and you're going to have a working Brainboard by next week that we can program and operate. So thanks for watching.